It started with a smell. Not loud, not sudden, but creeping, rotting, impossible to ignore. August 21st, 2002, Athens, Georgia. A hot summer afternoon. The kind where heat sits heavy on every street. At the River Glen Apartments, a quiet complex on the edge of town, residents began to complain. Something's wrong. There's this awful smell. Maintenance staff were sent to check. They walked the hallway, stopping outside Unit 408. The smell hit them hardest there. They knocked. No answer. They called out, hoping for a voice behind the door. Silence. They tried again. Nothing. Finally, a decision. They used a spare key. Hearts pounding, unsure what they'd find. The door creaked open. Heat rushed out, thick and oppressive. Then they saw her. A woman's body lay on the living room floor, partially covered by a sheet, only wearing underwear. Blood, dried and dark, stained the carpet around her. In that moment, shock turned to horror. They stepped back, fumbling for a phone. 911, we need police. Now. Within minutes, detectives from Athens Clark County Police arrived. Yellow tape, cameras, latex gloves snapping into place. The living room told a story of violence. Over 20 stab wounds, cuts on the woman's arms and hands, proof she fought desperately for her life. But strangely, no clear motive. No sign of sexual assault. Nothing obviously stolen. Detectives paused. A body half covered? It hinted at something chilling. Sometimes killers do that out of guilt or shame. As the crime scene team worked, one question loomed. Who was she? They searched for ID. Purse, wallet, mail, anything. Nothing. Not a single document revealed her name. Then detectives turned their eyes to the room itself. No sign of forced entry at the front door. But something caught their attention. The sliding balcony door, slightly ajar. Could the killer have come in that way? Or left that way? They took photos. Bagged everything. Fingerprints. Hair. Fibers. Hours turned to night. But in the middle of blood and chaos, they found something else. Almost invisible to the eye. A single drop of blood on a newspaper on the kitchen counter. Crime scene techs tested it. It didn't belong to the victim. It came from a man. Detectives felt a surge of hope. DNA could be the key. They checked it against the national database. Days later, the result came back. No match. And just like that, the case stayed wide open. Meanwhile, the medical examiner worked late into the night. The body had been there for several days. And the woman had fought. Her defensive wounds were clear. But why had no one come looking for her? Detectives needed to know who rented the apartment. They asked the building manager. He said the lease was in the name of a man named Richard, not the victim. Detectives made the call. Richard answered. He said he'd been out of state, in Florida, for work. Then came the revelation. The woman, he explained, was Pamela Chrysler. She'd been staying there while he was away. Detectives listened carefully. Richard described Pamela as a friend. They'd gone on a date once. Nothing more. He offered her his apartment so it wouldn't be empty. It sounded strange, but possible. Then, without prompting, Richard added, Pamela liked to sleep with the balcony door cracked open. Detectives exchanged a look. How did he know that? They hadn't shared it publicly. A detail that seemed small, but felt enormous. Before ending the call, Richard asked something else. Is the carpet badly stained? Maybe you could cut that part out so I can get it tested myself. Detectives felt something tighten in their chest. Why would a man miles away want the bloody carpet? The first shadows of suspicion began to form. The story was only just beginning. A woman dead, a man with a strange request, and a single drop of blood from someone no one could find. Stay with me, because what comes next twists deeper than anyone could imagine. Detectives hung up the phone, but the questions multiplied. A man leaves town. A woman stays in his apartment. She ends up dead, stabbed more than 20 times. And then that call. Cut out the blood-stained carpet. I'll get it tested myself. Why would Richard say that? Why not wait for police? Why the urgency and the need to take evidence into his own hands? Something felt off. Very off. When Richard returned from Florida, detectives brought him in. A room with blank walls, one table, a single recording camera blinking red. Detectives asked him to start from the beginning. Richard leaned back, voice steady at first. They'd met, he said, at a local community event. Pamela seemed kind. They went on one date, but it didn't become romantic. Still, they stayed in touch. Before his trip, he offered Pamela the apartment. She could watch the place, he explained. It made me feel better to know someone was there. Detectives nodded, but pressed deeper. Why offer your apartment to someone you barely knew? Richard hesitated, then shrugged. She seemed trustworthy. Detectives wrote that down. Trustworthy enough to live alone in your apartment? Richard nodded again, but his eyes flickered just for a second. Then came the detail that had bothered detectives from the start. You mentioned she liked to keep the balcony door open. How do you know that? Richard shifted in his chair. Oh, she told me once. Detectives paused. No one else knew that. The crime scene suggested that's how the killer entered. Why mention it unless you knew? The interview turned tense. Richard grew defensive. His answers got shorter. And then he tried to explain the carpet request. I just thought maybe if I had a piece, I could test it somewhere else. Help you guys? Detectives kept their faces neutral. But inside, alarms were blaring. Then they turned to the timeline. Richard claimed he'd been gone for weeks. I called Pamela every day, he said. 4 days ago, she stopped answering. Detectives did the math. The coroner estimated Pamela had been dead at least 3 days. Could Richard have killed her before leaving? They needed proof. Richard pulled out his phone, showed flight tickets, hotel receipts, names of coworkers he'd been with. Detectives made calls, checked every alibi, and it held. Richard really had been in Florida, hundreds of miles away, days before the murder. But what about DNA? Detectives had the drop of blood from the crime scene. They compared it to Richard's. Not a match. Frustration set in. Richard acted suspicious, said bizarre things. Yet every hard fact cleared him. Detectives had to do what they didn't want to do. Cross him off the suspect list. But doubts lingered. Why the obsession with the carpet? Why mention the balcony door? Richard's behavior stayed in the case file, just in case. With Richard ruled out, detectives turned to Pamela herself. Who would want to harm her? Why kill her, cover her body, but not assault her, and take nothing except an old vacuum cleaner? They looked deeper into her life. Friends, family, co-workers, former clients, some battling addiction or mental health crises. Was there someone with a grudge? Detectives interviewed everyone. They combed through records. Pamela had helped many people. Some struggled, some relapsed, but nothing linked anyone to her death. No threats, no angry ex-clients, no secret affairs, just silence. Then came the vacuum. Richard noticed it was missing when he returned. That's strange, he said. It wasn't valuable. Detectives wondered, could the vacuum have been taken by the killer? Was it pawned? Dumped? They checked pawn shops around Athens. Hope was fading until one shopkeeper nodded. Yeah, someone sold a vacuum like that recently. Detectives' hearts quickened. Do you have cameras? The clerk shook his head. Sorry, no cameras. But he remembered something. It was a young guy, maybe early 20s. They had no name, no photo, just the memory of a clerk. The investigation shifted again, from Richard to a mystery man, a man who had rolled Pamela's last possession out of the apartment. And somewhere, that single drop of blood on the newspaper still waited to reveal its secret. Stay with me, because in Chapter 3, the hunt for this unknown suspect takes a chilling turn. Detectives stood in that cluttered pawn shop, hearts pounding. They'd found something. Finally, describe him again, they urged. The shopkeeper frowned, trying to recall the face. Young guy, he said. Early 20s, maybe. Dark hair. Looked nervous. No cameras. No ID. Just a memory. But it was something. And in a case starved of leads, something was everything. Outside, detectives replayed it in their heads. Pamela's killer had stabbed her over 20 times, covered her body, left nothing of himself behind except a single drop of blood. But why take a vacuum cleaner? It wasn't valuable. It was big, awkward to carry. Unless the killer was trying to hide something inside. A knife? Clothes stained with blood? The theory haunted them. They retraced the timeline. Pamela had died days before the vacuum was pawned, so the killer kept it for a while, maybe hid evidence inside, then ditched it once the heat cooled off. It wasn't proof, but it was the best theory they had. Detectives kept digging. They checked pawn tickets. Nothing useful. No real name. Fake phone number. Dead end. Then they went back to the apartment complex. Richard had been cleared, but maybe neighbors had seen something. They knocked on doors. Faces peeked out nervous. Most said, "No, sorry. Didn't see anything." But one woman paused. Her eyes shifted as if replaying a memory. She hesitated, then spoke. Actually, there was something strange that night. She lived down the hall. The night Pamela was murdered, she couldn't sleep. She'd been pacing, soda can in hand. Then around midnight, she heard a noise. A scraping, a dragging sound outside her door. She peeked through the peephole and saw him. "A young man I didn't recognize," she whispered, rolling a vacuum cleaner out of Richard's apartment. Detectives leaned forward. What happened next? She swallowed. Just as I was about to open the door to ask if he needed help, I popped the soda can open. The hiss echoed in the hall. The man froze, turned his head, and stared directly at her door. His eyes, they were cold, she said. He stood there, maybe 3 for seconds, then left. He pulled the vacuum into the elevator and disappeared. Detectives asked, "Why didn't you report this before?" She looked down, ashamed. At the time, I thought maybe he was just helping Richard move something. I didn't think it mattered. Weeks had passed. The trail had cooled. But now, they finally had a witness. With her help, detectives worked with a sketch artist. Lines became shapes. Shadows became eyes. A young face emerged on paper. A face no one had seen, but one that had been there, rolling away with the last clue. They showed the sketch to the pawn shop clerk. His eyes widened. "Yeah, that looks like him." Detectives felt hope spark. A living witness. A sketch. And a victim who had, in her last moments, left behind the tiniest clue, a drop of blood. They released the sketch to local news. TV anchors flashed the face on screen. Police asked, "Do you know this man?" Phone lines were ready. Detectives waited, praying for tips. 1 hour. Nothing. 1 day. Nothing. 1 week. Nothing. The face in the sketch stayed nameless. The man stayed a ghost. Detectives kept searching. Every registered resident. Every visitor logged. Nothing matched. They revisited Pamela's life. Her patients. Her family. Her friends. No connection to anyone who looked like the man in the sketch. And just like that, hope flickered and dimmed. The vacuum? Gone. The man? Vanished. The blood drop? Still unmatched. The weight of unsolved murder hung over the case like heavy air. Pamela's family clung to hope. Detectives promised, "We won't stop." But nights turned into months. Months turned into years. The file was reopened again and again. Maybe this time, maybe we missed something. Each time it ended the same, dead end. Yet somewhere that unknown man was still out there. And that single drop of blood still sat in evidence, waiting. In Chapter 4, we'll see how the years of silence finally cracked. Thanks to a mistake the killer never saw coming. Years passed. Seasons changed. Detectives retired. New detectives took over. The case file of Pamela Chrysler, a thick stack of faded photos, reports, and that haunting composite sketch sat waiting on a shelf. Unsolved, unanswered, unfinished, but there was still one clue, silent yet stubborn. A single drop of blood on a newspaper by the kitchen counter. For 15 years, it sat in evidence, cold, preserved, no match in the database. Yet detectives refuse to forget. If his DNA ever enters the system, we'll know. Hope rested on that drop, tiny but powerful. And then, out of nowhere, the break they'd been waiting for. 15 years after Pamela was killed, detectives got a call from a lab. They spoke quickly. "We have a match." The name, Abdus Larro, 30 years old, living in Georgia. Detectives froze. They'd never heard his name before. He'd never been on any suspect list, never mentioned by neighbors, never connected to Pamela. Who is this man, they wondered. They dug into his background. Laura Rowe's childhood stunned them. He'd been raised in a notorious religious cult run by a man named Dwight York, a self-proclaimed prophet, hundreds of followers, a massive compound in Georgia, complete with pyramids and sphinxes built out of concrete. And darker secrets, too. When Laura Rowe was a child, he was one of several kids who accused York of horrific crimes. York was eventually convicted, sentenced to 135 years in prison for child molestation, racketeering, and more. Years later, as an adult, Laura Rowe recanted, said his childhood testimony was false. But by then, York was already locked away. Detectives asked the real question: how did Laura Rowe's DNA get into the system? Turns out, it wasn't violent crime that caught him. It was bootleg DVDs. Not long before the match, Laura Rowe had been arrested for selling pirated movies. He got probation. While still on probation, he was pulled over. Police found a small bag of illegal substances. That arrest required a DNA sample. And once the swab hit the federal database, ping, a perfect match to the drop of blood left behind at Pamela's apartment. Detectives felt the cold case come alive. 15 years of silence, broken by the tiniest mistake. They checked his history. Where was Laura Rowe in 2002? Chilling discovery. He'd lived in the same apartment complex as Pamela. Not her building, but just across the courtyard. Back then, he was 16 years old. Detectives pulled out the old composite sketch. They found Laura Rowe's high school yearbook photo, put them side by side. The resemblance was undeniable. Same face shape, same eyes. The ghost who'd pushed the vacuum down the hall finally had a name. They planned the interview carefully. They didn't want him to run. They knocked on his door, friendly voices. Hey, just a few questions about the complex you lived in back in 2002. Inside the small room, Laura Rowe sat across from them. Comment first. Do you remember Pamela Chrysler? He shook his head. Nope, don't know her. Ever been inside her apartment? No. Detectives leaned forward. Well, your DNA was found there. Laura Rowe blinked. Then, slowly, his story changed. Okay, maybe I was inside once. She paid me $40 to take out the trash. Detectives pushed. Then, why is your blood on the newspaper? Laura Rowe shifted in his chair. Sweat beaded on his forehead. I cut my hand while moving the trash, he stammered. Detectives didn't stop. That doesn't explain everything. Laura Rowe paused, eyes darting. Then he changed his story again. We were romantically involved, he said. That's why I was there. But Pamela had been 49. He was 16. No one had ever seen them together. Detectives knew he was lying, but they stayed calm. We'll need a fresh DNA sample, they said. Laura Rowe agreed. Swab, sealed, sent to the lab. As they waited, the case took a darker turn. An unexpected phone call came in. Laura Rowe's own brother had called the FBI tip line. He confessed to me years ago, his brother whispered. He said he broke into the apartment to steal something. Pamela woke up, so he stabbed her. Detectives felt the weight of 15 years lift. They had DNA, they had the brother's testimony, and finally, they had the man himself. The lab confirmed the blood was Laura Rowe's. There was nowhere left to run. In Chapter 5, we'll see how the killer finally faced justice and why prosecutors feared he might walk free. Laura Rowe sat in the interrogation room. The walls felt closer than before. The ticking clock on the wall, louder. Detectives didn't rush. They let silence do the work. We know what you did, they finally said. We know your blood was there. And your own brother told us what you confessed to him. Laura Rowe shifted in his chair. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. But still he tried to spin a story. Pamela and we had a relationship, he claimed. That's why my blood was there. It's not what you think. Detectives stayed calm. They'd heard the same pattern before. Denial, partial truth, blame the victim. But they had something stronger this time. Proof. They reminded him. You were 16. Pamela was nearly 50. Nobody ever saw you together. And you never mentioned this before. Lar Rowe went quiet. His foot tapped under the table. The detective leaned forward. It's over, Lar Rowe. Tell us the truth. Minutes felt like hours. Then, Lar Rowe broke the silence. Okay, I was there, he mumbled. I was trying to steal something. She surprised me. I panicked. He didn't say the words, I killed her. But he didn't have to. His face said it all. Detectives had what they needed. DNA at the crime scene, a confession to his brother. And Lar Rowe himself, finally cornered by truth. But prosecutors saw the case differently. A single drop of blood, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no direct eyewitness to the crime itself. 15 years had passed. Evidence had faded. Memories blurred. Would a jury buy it? Prosecutors worried. What if the defense convinced them it was a teenage mistake, a cut finger during a harmless visit? What if the jury doubted the brother's testimony, calling it revenge or fabrication? If that happened, Lar Rowe could walk free. And Pamela's family would watch justice slip away again. So they made a choice. Offer a deal. Plead guilty to manslaughter and theft. Avoid life in prison and the death penalty. Behind bars, Lar Rowe's lawyer told him what was on the table. 20 years. If you don't take it, you could get life, or worse. Lar Rowe signed. No emotion. No apology. He confessed, on paper, that he broke into Pamela's apartment to steal. When she woke up and caught him, he stabbed her. Then dragged her body into the living room, covered her with a sheet, and took the vacuum cleaner, the only thing he thought he could pawn. Pamela's family heard the news. They had waited 15 long years. 15 years of not knowing. Of wondering if the killer was still nearby, still free. And now, finally they had an answer. At sentencing, Lar Rowe showed little remorse. No tears. No apology to Pamela's loved ones. He was handed 20 years in prison. After that, another 20 years of strict supervision. If he breaks even a minor law after release, he goes back to prison. He'll be eligible for freedom in 2038, when he's 52. Until then, Pamela's family tries to find peace. They still keep her photos on the mantle, her old notebooks, the degrees she worked so hard to earn. All reminders of a woman who dedicated her life to helping others, and whose life ended with a random act of violence from a neighbor kid she never really knew. For detectives, the case is technically closed, but the memory of Pamela's last moments never fully leaves them. One detective later admitted, "It still bothers me. She trusted people. She tried to help everyone, and that's what made her vulnerable." And for Lar Rowe, what finally exposed him wasn't clever police work or a witness's memory. It wasn't a breakthrough from new forensics. It was something so mundane it feels almost cruel. Getting caught selling bootleg DVDs, a single arrest, a single DNA swab, and the truth he'd hidden for 15 years finally surfaced. But why did he take that vacuum cleaner? And what really happened that night inside apartment 408? In Chapter 6, we'll revisit that final night and piece together what the evidence tells us about Pamela's last moments. It's August 2002, a warm Georgia night. Cicadas buzzing in the darkness. Inside apartment 408, Pamela Chrysler is winding down after work. Maybe she's reading. Maybe she's journaling. She often did. The balcony door is slightly open, letting in the humid breeze. She feels safe here. New city. Fresh start. She has no idea danger is just steps away. Outside, in the courtyard, a 16-year-old kid watches. Abdus Lar Rowe, a neighbor from another building. Someone Pamela probably never noticed, but he'd noticed her, seen her coming and going. Middle-aged woman, living alone. Easy target. And that night, he makes a choice that will destroy 2 lives forever. Lar Rowe sneaks to the balcony. The sliding door is cracked open. He pushes it gently. Inside, the living room is quiet, shadows stretching across the floor. He doesn't bring a weapon. Maybe he thinks she's asleep. Or maybe he doesn't think at all. He slips inside, looking for cash, anything he can sell. Pamela isn't asleep. She hears something, a floorboard creak, breath in the dark. She turns and sees him, a teenager in her living room, rummaging through her things. Maybe she shouts. Maybe she freezes. We'll never know her exact words. But the autopsy tells the next part. She fights back. Defensive wounds cover her hands and arms. She doesn't run. She stands her ground. Pamela, the woman who dedicated her life to helping broken people, now forced to fight one. Lauro panics. In the struggle, he finds a knife. Kitchen? Coffee table? We don't know. And then the attack. More than 20 stab wounds. Fast. Frenzied. No sign of sexual assault. No clear plan. Just raw fear and violence. When it's over, Pamela lies on the floor, blood pooling beneath her. The living room walls stained. Silence returns, except for Lauro's ragged breathing. Then a strange moment. He covers her body with a sheet. Detectives later debated why. Guilt? Pity? Or an instinct to hide what he'd done? We'll never know. Then comes the final bizarre detail. He takes the vacuum cleaner. Why? Maybe he thinks he can pawn it. Maybe he needs something to carry stolen items in. Maybe, as detectives suspect, he hides the bloody knife inside the vacuum bag. That would explain why he'd bother dragging such an awkward thing out of the building. The neighbor across the hall hears a noise, opens her peephole, sees him. Young man, dark hair, rolling a vacuum down the hallway. She hesitates, doesn't open the door, and that moment of doubt keeps her safe, but lets Lauro disappear into night. At the pawn shop, he sells the vacuum, doesn't use his real name, leaves no ID, just one more faceless criminal transaction. Then he goes back to life, school, friends, family, and for 15 years, the memory of what happened stays locked away. Detectives later discover the truth by following a trail as thin as spider silk. A single drop of blood on a newspaper. The neighbor's memory. A sketch that almost no one recognized. All fragile. All nearly forgotten. Yet together enough to catch him. Why did Pamela leave the balcony door open? She liked fresh air. It made her feel less alone. Why did she let herself stay so vulnerable? Because she believed in people. She'd spent a lifetime seeing the best in them. That's the tragedy. Pamela never saw herself as a victim. Even in her final moments, the evidence shows she fought back. She wasn't passive. She resisted. She made sure the man who killed her left behind a piece of himself. One drop of blood. Small, but powerful enough to unlock the truth years later. And Lauro? At 16, he probably thought he'd gotten away with it. Life moved on, but the past never really let go. In our final chapter, we'll look at what happened after the arrest, how Pamela's family finally got answers, and how a random mistake changed everything forever. The moment the handcuffs clicked shut around Abdus Lauro's wrists, 15 years of silence finally broke. A case that had haunted detectives, neighbors, and Pamela's family was no longer unsolved. But closure isn't always clean, and justice doesn't always feel complete. In court, Lauro barely spoke. No apology, no tears, just cold paperwork. His signature on a plea deal. Pamela's family sat in the gallery, staring at the man who took her life. They'd imagined this face 1,000 times. Now it was real. A prosecutor read the confession aloud. Broke into the apartment. Pamela woke up, panicked, stabbed her, took a vacuum cleaner, left. So many years of questions, answered in a few lines of dry text. But even as the words echoed through the courtroom, some questions would never have answers. Why her? Why that night? What was he really thinking when he picked up that knife? Pamela had been more than a victim. She'd been a daughter, a counselor who helped people fight addiction and trauma, a woman who built her life on kindness and second chances. It felt cruel that her own life ended because she'd opened a balcony door for fresh air in a new city she hoped would bring peace. The prosecutor faced a hard choice. They could gamble on a jury trial and risk Lauro walking free because the evidence was thin, just a single drop of blood and a secondhand confession. Or they could take the plea, 20 years in prison for manslaughter and theft. No life sentence, no death penalty, but at least certainty. Pamela's family agreed reluctantly. They wanted a trial. They wanted every detail exposed, but they wanted to make sure Lar Rowe wouldn't walk out the same door he used to sneak in that night. At sentencing, Lar Rowe stood silent. No words to the family. No explanation of why he killed. His eyes fixed on the floor, as if even he couldn't face what he'd done. He'll be eligible for parole in 2038 when he's 52. After that, 20 years of supervision. If he breaks even the smallest law, back to prison. For Pamela's family, that timeline feels unfair. They got a life sentence of grief. He got a number of years. Detectives finally closed the file labeled Chrysler Pamela. It had gathered dust for over a decade, but even with the case closed, they still wondered, what if that drop of blood had never been collected? What if Lar Rowe had never sold those DVDs? What if the neighbor hadn't peeked through the peephole? Sometimes justice hangs by a single thread. The neighbor who saw Lar Rowe rolling the vacuum down the hall said she often thought about that night. "I almost opened the door," she whispered to a reporter, "but something in my gut told me to stay quiet. I wonder what would have happened to me if I hadn't." For years, Lar Rowe must have thought he'd gotten away with murder. 16 years old, living across the courtyard, fading into adulthood. But his own brother couldn't carry the secret forever, and a random arrest for bootleg DVDs brought his DNA into the system. Not clever detective work, not new forensic science, just an ordinary mistake that exposed an extraordinary crime. Pamela's family finally knew the truth. They knew she hadn't been targeted for revenge. She hadn't lived a secret life. It was random, pointless. A young man's panicked violence in the middle of the night. That answer didn't bring her back, but it ended the cruelest part, the not knowing. Today, Pamela's memory lives on in the people she helped. Former clients came forward to say her kindness kept them alive. Friends remember her as a woman who believed everyone deserved another chance, even people no one else trusted. It's a tragic irony that this very belief, that openness, may have put her in harm's way. And Lar Rowe? He'll sit behind bars counting the years, haunted perhaps by the memory of the woman who fought back and whose fight left a mark he could never wash away. In the end, this wasn't just a case about murder. It was about how even the smallest clue, a single drop of blood, can speak louder than 1,000 lies, and how sometimes justice arrives years late, but still arrives. Share your thoughts below. Do you think 20 years was enough? Should Lar Rowe have faced trial? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more real-life crime stories that reveal the hidden truths behind unsolved mysteries. Thank you for watching.